Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Alexandra Henry, and I'm the Oral History Lead at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center. Before introducing our guest speaker, I would like to acknowledge that NCTC is located in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, in the homeland of the Massachusetts Nation, and for that we give thanks. As it is on these lands that we are able to conduct the continuing education of service employees and our partners. Today, we are going to hear about federal native trust lands from Frank Desmond Rollefson. And as a reminder, our next broadcast will be a discussion on developing land acknowledgements on Thursday, September 16th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Frank Desmond Rollefson, or Desi, has 15 years with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He has experience as the Rangeland Manager for the Northern Cheyenne Agency, Natural Resource Officer for the Crow Agency, Water Rights Specialist for Rocky Mountain Regional Office, RMRO, and Cartographic Technician and Wildlife Biologist, both for RMRO. Desi has participated with Post-Wildlife Assessment Crews or the Burned Area Emergency Response Team for Regional Reservation Trust Lands. Desi is of German, Norwegian, and Northern Cheyenne descent. He is an enrolled member of the Northern Cheyenne, and his families are from Minnesota and Montana. Desi received his bachelor's in biology from the University of Montana in 1997 and his master's in resource management from Central Washington University in 2003. Desi, I'll hand it over to you now.
Hello, my name is Frank Desmond Rollefson. I go by Desi like Arnez. I was humbled to be asked to give this presentation on federal Native American trust lands. I've been a federal employee for 15 years. Before that, I worked for the Northern Cheyenne Tribe Natural Resources Department doing wetlands work, 104B3 program through the Clean Water Act. And then I went over to the Bureau of Indian Affairs and have had several different jobs with them, over the course of which I've learned a few things about federal Indian lands. I will go ahead and get started with the presentation. Okay, so we're going to start with some history of the origin of the United States land base and the legal precedents. And then we'll move on to treaty and reservation eras, and also talk a little bit about federal lands in the West, and finish it up with some Endangered Species Act implications and examples that I've encountered. So it'll be a little bit of history and legal stuff, and then we'll get on to some maps. Incidentally, I have taken a few courses at NCTC, which was sort of my link into this venue. Okay. So this is a map showing the initial land claims by the 4 or 5 European countries that employed what was called the Doctrine of Discovery on the American continent. The English, the French, and the Spanish all made essentially continent-wide land claims that were rooted in essentially some theological underpinnings that are how the Doctrine of Discovery was functioning. And so you can see it's the English and the French and the Spanish. I've come across in my research some interesting phrases concerning the three of them, but it's essentially when they came across and laid claims against lands that had no Christians in them, they were backed up by the papal bulls, which was coming out of Rome. Here's an example of some of the translated Latin that was used. Discovered very remote islands and mainlands, and by authority of their religion, they essentially lay claim upon this, of jurisdictions of all kinds, the discovery doctrine, which would later be implemented as federal Indian law through the Supreme Court, basically equates that discovery is equal to conquest. This has been used all the way up until present day. The concept that essentially conquest denies Aboriginal title. In 1954, this was backed up, and even in 2007 with an Oneida case up in New York State, that has been, the doctrine of discovery is still being cited by the Supreme Court. So that's sort of the underpinnings as we move forward towards the different land statuses. This is essentially the westward expansion through time in different areas that have been acquired by the United States. As I mentioned, the Spanish and the English and the French, there's an old report, the 1896 American Bureau of Ethnology report, which catalogs and analyzes the means by which the United States was populated by Europeans and the acquiring of title. But one of the interesting things was that in the description in this old report from 1896 was that the Spanish civilization crushed the Indian, the English civilization scorned and neglected him, and the French civilization embraced and cherished him. Later on, under the Continental Congress, the states gave up their western land claims. Jefferson said to turn over the unrealized land claims to the central government, and this was enacted in the land ordinances of 1785 and 1787. This was in response to Virginia, whose original land grant had parallel southern and northern borders going all the way to the Great Western Sea. And so they weren't going to allow states to extend their boundaries all the way across the country. And they said that would go to the central government. Now, in the Constitution of the United States, there's a few clauses that should be mentioned. One's the Treaty Clause, Article 2, Section 2, empowers the president to propose and negotiate treaties with other countries. The tribes were treated as other countries upon receiving 2/3 supermajority approval by the Senate. It becomes federal binding law. This is backed up by the Supremacy Clause, Article 6, that basically says that federal laws made pursuant to it and treaties made under its authority constitute supreme law of the land, provided that state courts are bound to the supreme law. In the case of conflict between federal and state, federal law is applied and state constitutions being subordinate to federal law. There's 3 places in the United States Constitution that reference Native Americans, or Indians as they were called. One is Article 1, Section 2, having to do with excluding Indians from being taxed. Article 1, Section 8 has to do with the Commerce Clause. And then the last one, the 14th Amendment, was sort of an interesting one. That one amends portions of Article 1, Section 2, having to do with apportionment of taxes. I had to ask my father, who's a history teacher, about the 14th Amendment. And it's one of 3 Reconstruction amendments. And the 14th extended citizenship to Black slaves. And so it also has to do with the taxes and the apportionment. And there's some, if you delve deep enough into it, you get into the area where where Africans were considered 3/5 of a person for apportionment purposes. 3 concepts that come out of this federal analysis are the territorial sovereignty, the plenary power doctrine of Congress. Congress has ultimate control over tribal lands, not the president or the judicial branch. And then the trust relationship between the federal government and the tribes, duty to protect the tribes, and the necessary legislation and effective authorities to complete that duty. There's a lot of Supreme Court cases that sort of help form these concepts and doctrines. The three main ones, and you can't have a historical discussion of United States Native Americans without going over these three, the Marshall Trilogy. One being the Johnson v. McIntosh case, the other one being Cherokee versus Georgia, and the third one being Worcester versus Georgia. The first one basically says that Native Americans don't own the land outright and can't sell it to whomever they please, only to the federal government. The second one establishes a ward guardian relationship between the federal government and tribes, where the federal government is the guardian and the tribes are the ward. And then Worcester v. Georgia basically says that the federal government is the sole authority when it comes to dealing with Indian nations and not states or private entities. The first case in 1823 has the most to deal with the actual land status of Native American lands. This was a case where Johnson's descendants inherited his land, and they leased the land. They had gotten the land directly from the natives. McIntosh had a land patent from the General Land Office. The lessees brought a suit against McIntosh saying he didn't own it. Essentially, the ruling was that the Native American tribe did not have the right to convey the land, and that McIntosh's patent was valid. Essentially, what this meant was that only the government, rather than the Native Americans, held title to the land, and that the discovery gave title to the government, the nation making the discovery the sole right of acquiring the soil from the natives. This diminished the tribe's sovereignty and independence when they didn't have the power to dispose of their soil to whomever they pleased. Again, founded on the fundamental principle that discovery gave exclusive title to those who made it. And so that's sort of the discovery equals conquest equals exclusive title. In 1851, we start to see the reservations start to form. In 1830, there was the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears down in the southeast, And in 51, as part of the Indian Appropriations Act, they started to remove natives onto reservations, typically west of the Mississippi River. According to the government, the reservations were created to protect the Native Americans from growing encroachment of Europeans moving westward. And then in 1871, the House of Representatives put a rider on the Indian Appropriations Bill saying they wanted to do away with treaties, treaty-making processes. Treaties were negotiated by the Senate, requiring 2/3 majority, and the House was really left out of the loop. And so they disliked that, and they held the Appropriations Act kind of hostage until that was removed. And so treaties ceased with the passage of the 1871 Indian Appropriation Act, declaring that no Indian nation or tribe would be recognized as an independent nation, tribe, or power with whom the United States may contract treaties. And so it's kind of interesting that in 1823, they had already ruled that tribes don't have a right of title, they only have a right of occupancy. But then for nearly 50 years, they continued making treaties with them, when in the background, in the legal system, they'd already determined that the tribes didn't own the land by virtue of Doctrine of Discovery. Okay, so that's enough legal history. Now we'll kind of look at some maps that show the contraction of native lands through time. This is a little animated thing that comes from Louisiana State. I think they did a pretty good job. And there we go. That's the present scenario. You can see how it really, by the time you get to 1860, it was really getting very small amounts of land left. This image comes from the 1896 Bureau of American Ethnology report that cataloged all the treaties and land descriptions and cessions that tribes went through. It's a fascinating source of material if you're serious about looking at Native American lands. The numbers in here reference, they're called Royce area numbers that reference specific treaties and the land descriptions within those treaties for cessions that the tribes were making. One of the means that the United States used to get these land cessions was indebtedness. They would try to, through the fort system, make tribes heavily indebted so that they would be willing to lop off a cession of land to take care of the debt that they had incurred at the fort systems. This is the Montana Map 2, which shows that it's contracted even more. This is sort of the last set of treaties that went through before 71. And so what I was able to do was to take these old maps and then in GIS, using a time-lapse function, animate a few of these. And so here, this is the Blackfeet tribes' lands as they change through treaty. And it's pretty fascinating to watch. You'll see this polygon move and then contract through time. So in 1851, they had 23.7 million acres acknowledged by the United States as Blackfeet. And then we'll watch through time how it went. Executive Order 73, Acts of Congress. And then that last one over here on the western side of Blackfeet, that's when in 1896 they decided to make Glacier Park. And so they took that portion from Blackfeet. And the Acts of Congress, after they stopped doing treaties, they just did things through Acts of Congress with basically no input or consent from the tribes. They just legislated it as part of their plenary power that the courts had already established before. This is Crows. Good portion of Crow is now, Old Crow land is in Yellowstone National Park. In 68 treaty, and we get to Acts of Congress, 82. And then the final one in 1904, I believe. Yeah. Down to the current size of Crow Reservation. Got one more. This is Flathead, which is about 16 million acres over in western Montana. Very scenic part of the country. They got split into two parts. The South Reservation existed for 7 years. That was called the Bitterroot Reservation. And then they relocated all the Salish and Kootenai up to the Jocko Reserve, which is what we call the Flathead Reservation now. And this is in my neck of the woods. The Bureau of Indian Affairs Rocky Mountain region is Montana and Wyoming. And these show the original 1851 recognized boundaries for the Flathead, the Blackfeet, and the Crow. And then you can see the reservations that are inside those greater exterior boundaries. So the next legislation that came through was the Allotment Act of 1887. And this was part of a greater push to more or less break up the tribe's land base. And so they gave each head of household an allotment, 160 acres typically, but there's a wide variance based on which region of the country and which reservation you're talking about. Once they allotted out to all the heads of household on the rolls that they had, they sold the surplus lands within the boundaries of the reservation or opened them up for settlement for free. And so this created a checkerboarding effect on the reservations and sort of a jurisdictional quagmire for a great many things, not the least of which being law enforcement. But there were some opponents to the Allotment Act. Henry M. Teller of Colorado in 1881 said that that allotment was a policy to despoil the Indians of their lands and make them vagabonds on the face of the earth, and that the pretext to get these lands and occupy them, if it was done in greed, it would be bad enough, but to do it in the name of humanity for the benefit of the natives was a little bit too much for him to accept. And so he opposed the Allotment Act. Senator Dawes was actually a senator from Massachusetts. Okay, so you start to see these signs, Indian land for sale, where they're selling lands within the reservation boundaries. Some of our employees in our real estate services office think that they get a good chuckle out of this perfect title possession within 30 days, because nowadays it takes a long time to get perfect title. Here's another example of public sale of Indian lands within reservation boundaries. This one down at Wind River, which was originally called the Shoshone Agency, down in Wyoming. Okay, so now we have all these native lands that are federal lands held in trust. If you look at their federal land patents on all the allotments in the tribal tracts that are owned by the United States government on behalf of the tribes. And all of these lands are regulated through a section of the Code of Federal Regulations 25, which is just dedicated to Indians. And there's numerous parts dealing with different aspects of the trust responsibility the government has towards these lands. Probate, recordation, leasing, timber sales, grazing, mineral development, etc. There are also sections that deal with off-reservation fishing rights in the Pacific Northwest and the Great Lakes area. And I anticipate a new section in the CFR dealing with off-reservation hunting rights as a result of the Herrera Supreme Court case having to do with the Crow hunting on fed lands outside their reservation, but within their ceded areas. This is an example of the different types of tracts, federal trust native tracts that exist: tribal tract, tribal original, tribal reserve, allotment, special allotment. And then down at the bottom, you have fee land or simple patent, which tribes can own land in fee, and so can individual Indians. You can have your allotment taken out of trust and put into fee if you want to get a loan on it, say, or use it for collateral. So it does exist, but the bulk of tribal lands are federal trust lands. So this is an example of the Crow Indian Reservation with the different, we don't have tract numbers or any kind of PII information on here. It's just color coded. The green being tribal tracts and the yellow being allotments. And then all the spaces in between are fee private lands that were opened up and sold. And so at Crow, it's probably about a 50-50 split, maybe 55-45 trust to fee. Here's a map of the Northern Cheyenne Reservation where I'm enrolled. Interestingly, Northern Cheyenne is 97% in trust, and that's because of the lag time between the Allotment Act in 1887 and when they got around to actually issuing the allotments on Northern Cheyenne, which wasn't until the 1920s. So my great-grandfather and my grandfather have allotments on Northern Cheyenne, issued to them in the 20s. By 1930, the Merriam Report was produced, which led to the Indian Reorganization Act of 34. And in the Merriam Report, they determined that the Allotment Act actually wasn't in the best interest of the Native Americans because they'd lost about 2/3 of their land base through it. And so they ceased selling the surplus lands in the 30s. And so Northern Cheyenne was sort of a hybrid. They got the allotments, but they didn't have the surplus land sold off. The Rocky Boys Reservation in Montana didn't get any allotments issued. They were last on the list to get allotments assigned, and it was already the 1930s, so they didn't get any allotments, and it's just one large tribal tract that they deal with over there. This is an example of the Fond du Lac Reservation in northern Minnesota off the tip of Lake Superior. You can see here that the majority of the reservation is in fee status, private land holdings. This is an example of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa in North Dakota and their land cessions through time. And they really, they were run roughshod over by the Dakota territories at the time. And they got shrunk all the way down by various means to 2 townships up near Belcourt. And then it got time to do the allotments from the Allotment Act, and the reservation had been reduced to such a small area that there wasn't enough land to allot out to all the heads of household. And so they issued patents on public domain tracts spread across 5 states. And so in Montana, there's about 380 Turtle Mountain public domain tracts that were taken from, basically they took BLM tracts and gave them over as allotments to the Turtle Mountain Chippewas. So if you can imagine being a Turtle Mountain Chippewa over in Belcourt, and the Indian agent gives you a land patent and tells you you've got an allotment 200 miles west of here in Montana, good luck. That was the scenario they were dealing with. We still keep tally on these Turtle Mountain tracts. We've actually done work with water rights on them, and we go and do field and spot checks on them to make sure there's not trespassing going on and things of that nature. So in sum, after the Allotment Act of 1887, United States is about 2.3 trillion acres total. In 1887, 149 million acres were still with the tribes. Allotment Act, that got reduced to about 1/3. Since then, tribes have been acquiring lands and converting them into trust. There's a process for that. And so it's grown to 56 million acres. I've been trying to tack down a more current number. I believe it's around 57.5 now, but I don't have complete confirmation of that. One of the interesting aspects in the western part of the United States is the amount of federal lands that exist out here. BLM lands, Forest Service lands. And the reason for this, if you remember what Virginia was trying to do, where they wanted the whole state to go all the way across the country. Here's the Statehood Enabling Act for North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Washington. And inside these Statehood Enabling Acts, when they're converting from territories to states, they were required to renunciate any public land requirements. They would forever disclaim all right and title to all unappropriated public lands within the boundaries of their states. And that included all Indian lands until the United States extinguished if they ever chose to extinguish those Indian lands. And so that's why there's so much fed land in the West. As the states came in, they couldn't make a claim on any of that open ground. It was going to be federal land. So this is the basic lay of the federal lands in the West. As you can see in the East, there isn't a whole lot. As you get further west, if you look at Nevada and Utah, it's almost primarily federal land. And here's a pie chart of the breakdown. So as you can see, U.S. BIA is about 2% tribal lands of the entire thing. Private's the biggest single entity, and then fed lands make up maybe a third or so. This comes from a congressional research report in 2014. So now, what are the implications of Endangered Species Act on these federal native trust lands? Well, Section 7 of the ESA definitely has play. Consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service is a normal course of events when we have projects that happen on tribal trust land, if it's going to affect a listed species. And so we also have Section 10 exceptions and safe harbor agreements and 10J experimental populations for, say, black-footed ferret. That's a popular one. We've had a number of projects on crow, Fort Belknap, Northern Cheyenne. Right now at Fort Belknap, there's a Section 10 agreement in place that encompasses the Fort Belknap Reservation and the surrounding counties. There's also a swift fox effort up there. Swift fox aren't listed, but there's with WWF and the Smithsonian, there's a current project on Fort Belknap for capturing swift fox down in Colorado and Wyoming and translocating them up north here to Fort Belknap, and they're distributing them in the general area. GPS collars is pretty cool stuff. This is an example of the black-footed ferret recovery zone on Crow, where we've been releasing ferrets that are brought up from Colorado at the Black-footed Ferret Recovery Center. They've got a good set of folks working down there. And so we release them here, and there's various arrangements made with the tribe. In this case, on Crow, they used a safe harbor agreement, but in actuality, probably the better tool to use is a Section 10, because safe harbor agreements are typically generated towards private lands, where the Section 10 is for federal lands. And if there's a take-home message from this presentation, is that majority of tribal lands are federal lands, and so they're affected by various federal legislation like the Endangered Species Act, National Environmental Policy Act, NAGPRA, etc. This is an interesting map having to do with Section 7 consultation. This is Blackfeet. For that northern population of grizzly bear, there is an interagency strategic management plan that the BIA is a signatory on, along with the National Park Service and Fish and Wildlife Service. And so the red area on the left side of the map is Management Zone 5 for grizzly bears. And any project with roads or putting in something with a senior center or a gas station that occurs in that red area, it kicks on the Section 7 consultation, and we have to notify and bounce it off the Fish and Wildlife Service. Okay, we're getting towards the end. This is the overall map of the United States. I'm a little bit remiss, I don't have Alaska in here, but that's the reservation lands as we know them now. These are the BIA regions. Interestingly, the eastern region, the BIA headquarters are in Nashville, and from Maine down to Florida, there's about 500,000 acres of federal trust land that they manage for various reasons, be it for timber or for agriculture, or if they have to go and do some fire mop up, they'll do some of that stuff there. And they're based out of Nashville, but they got a huge spread that they're responsible for. I am over here in Rocky Mountain, and so we just have these tribes and these reservations that we handle over here. Okay, that is the end of my presentation. I certainly appreciate everybody who's listening. And it's time for questions, I believe. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. We'll go ahead and go into some questions and answers now. And if any of you viewers have any questions for Desi, please enter them into the chat and we will try and get to your question. So to get us started, I have a few questions here already. And one of them is, are there lands available to be turned into federal native trust lands? And if so, what are some examples?
Okay, yes, there are lands available. The lands within the reservation boundaries, the tribes have right of first refusal to buy those lands first, should they come up for sale. So there's a means for them to sort of make the reservations whole one bit at a time. They can also buy lands outside the reservation and go through the process of getting it converted back into trust. It's a lot easier for tribes as an entity to convert the land back into trust than it is for individual Indians. Individual Indians can do it, but there's a couple more stringent rules applied to individuals than there are for whole tribes.
All right. Do you happen to know how many acres of tribal lands there are in the United States?
Well, there's at least 56 million acres of trust lands that are divided between the tribal tracts and the individual Indian allotments. I don't know what the breakdown is between those two, but there's at least 56 million acres. I'd say it's probably closer to 57 now.
And are all lands within Native American reservation boundaries considered tribal land?
That one is a little bit up for debate. There are definitely lands that are not tribal tracts within the boundaries. But depending on the legislation of that tribe within their tribal government, they may have asserted jurisdiction over all lands within their boundaries, whether it be trust or fee lands, particularly for law enforcement purposes. There may be some tribes who've gone to that effort.
And how do you think we can increase public knowledge and understanding in federal native trust lands?
Well, in Montana, the state legislature has a pool of money where they're supposed to teach about Native American history specific to Montana. And so if some of that education could start pervading through just basic factual information about how much land and where it went and what the trend is now, I think that might be a good start.
And generally speaking, how do you think tribes tend to view federal native trust lands? Just kind of like a little overview of what you've heard from people, or if you've heard any opinions from anyone.
In general, I'd say that the tribes would like more of their trust lands returned to them, either by buying it outright themselves or through various other means. So it's the last of the lands that they have left after the last few hundred years, and so they really cherish it and they respect it. Interestingly, a lot of the reservation lands have become wildlife refugia due to being rural and undeveloped. And so you see species at elevation ranges that you might not see somewhere else. It might not be a real exotic species, it might be just a toad or something. But the wildlife have kind of keyed in on these areas as being less developed than your normal private lands.
Right. We do have a question from the chat. On your last slide of your presentation, California and Minnesota had their own region. Why was that?
Yeah, so California inherited the rancheria system that the Spanish that the Spanish had set up in California, and so I can't remember how many there are. There's a lot of them. They're very small. Some of them are somewhat lucrative with casinos these days, and so I think because of the history, that's why they probably did their own regions. I don't really claim to know why the BI divided it up in these different regions. Michigan, I'll have to take a closer look at that. I'm seeing the question on the chat here. I thought Michigan was part of the Great Lake, but I think it might be part of Eastern. The further east you go, of course, the fewer tribes there are. So I'm not entirely sure on that.
So I don't see any new questions coming in. We can kind of hold off and see if anyone else has any. Oh, here's one that just came in. When the island of Manhattan was sold to the Dutch, were we later taught that the natives did not believe in ownership of land? I think the rest of that question got cut off. I'm assuming they're asking, when and how did that change? So why were we kind of taught that natives did not believe in ownership of land?
Yeah, I don't know why we were taught of that. It's a fascinating concept, and Manhattan is sort of the poster child of a tribe being royally taken advantage of. And I believe the concept of natives not having an ownership ideology was sort of used as a justification for taking advantage of them. They for sure had notions of territories and of resource management with their neighboring tribes. I mean, in New England, all the towns that are called Springfield, Northfield, Greenfield, those were fields that were farming areas by the natives who would go away seasonally and then return to their farming areas and find them occupied and treated as if they were deserted. And the easy out for that is, well, they don't believe in ownership. And so that's my take.
Yeah, that makes sense. So another question has come in. Are there any good examples of tribes winning a case against the U.S. government?
So the current one is the Herrera case of a couple years ago, where a Crow tribal member went and shot an elk on in Wyoming. The Crow boundary goes right up to the Wyoming border on fed land in Wyoming. And they issued him a violation. He said, no, this is part of my treaty hunting rights. And in the end, he won. And they said, yeah, that is part of your treaty hunting rights to hunt in your ceded area on fed lands. And so that's an example, the Herrera Supreme Court case. Oh, and another one was, I believe, reservation in Oklahoma, where the boundary of the reservation was in question, heavily checkerboarded with a lot of private land, and the private landowners didn't want to be under the jurisdiction of the tribes. They took it to court and said that the reservation doesn't exist anymore. It's lost its Indian character. And the Supreme Court came back and said, no, only Congress can change the boundaries of these reservations, irregardless of what the locals are saying. And so the tribe won, and their boundary is still the same.
Interesting. So we're just waiting for any more questions coming in. Is there anything you would want to add, a supplement to your presentation that you might want to expand upon?
Well, if there's any prospective PhD students out there, I think there are some opportunities to produce some work that would benefit the tribes, particularly in righting the wrongs of the Allotment Act. I've looked around, and there's no Ivy League schools that have geography doctoral degrees. So you have to go to University of Minnesota or Clarkson. But somebody could do an analysis on what it would cost to make reservation lands whole again through an appropriation from Congress. And you'd have to do an appraisal analysis and pick some reservations as your sampling points. And you could massage a dissertation that resulted in a turnkey legislation bill that somebody could maybe try and get through Congress.
So we had a comment come in about one of the first questions I asked you about ownership and what that means to Native peoples. The comment comes from Carrie from California, and they say ownership doesn't have the same meaning in Indigenous versus Western epistemologies. I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong. There is more of a reciprocal relationship and responsibility with Indigenous worldviews. Western ways of viewing ownership is based on the rights to use something. So this person was just trying to clarify that ownership was very different between the two groups of people, and so that might be also why we were taught incorrectly due to that loss of translation in what those words mean to each group.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things, just anecdotally, since we got a couple minutes, I have an uncle of mine who's a Cheyenne as his first language, and he conceives of things in Cheyenne and translates them to English. And it's similar to a linguistic theory called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which basically says that you think in the language that you speak. And in Cheyenne, the images produced when you speak certain sentences are really way different than the English concepts. And so in Cheyenne, the importance of human beings is way down the priority list. The opposite of made in God's image, I'm number one. Everything else is more important, and we're just here almost like stewards, making sure all this other stuff can still be here for the future generations. And that's embedded in the linguistics, and the images that are produced when you're speaking Cheyenne are reinforced with this sort of ethic that we aren't number one, we're way down the list, and really quite opposite of an English worldview where all of creation was made here for the sole benefit of man or something like this. It is really the other way around is the view that I've heard from my uncle in any case.
I like that. So I believe we are getting down to running out of time. So if there are any last minute questions, and it looks like we just have one pop up. The dissertation you mentioned, if the dissertation you mentioned were done, what would the next step be? For example, where do we go from here? So I guess based off what you asked for the dissertation, do you have any further steps you would advise for whoever would be taking this as a thesis?
Well, for the individual, it would probably have to be through a law department or a geography department. It would involve both. And if the end result was a turnkey bill to present to the legislature, which essentially be a large appropriation to buy out lands within the reservation boundaries. Consensual, of course. We wouldn't do what happened to the natives and just force it on them, but pay them fair market, maybe even 1.5 fair market, just for the effort. And once that was in place and it got through Congress, then it would roll out on its own. And there would be this massive nationwide effort to make these reservations whole again. Probably pie in the sky stuff, but consider.
All right. It looks like we have a comment of thanks for your presentation, and it was very interesting and informative. And with that, I suppose we can go ahead and end for the day. So I want to thank you, Desi, for sharing your knowledge with us today. We truly appreciate your time. And again, as a reminder to our viewers, NCTC will continue hosting the Tribal Broadcast Series on the third Thursday of each and every month. Please plan to join us for our next broadcast, which is titled Developing Land Acknowledgements, on Thursday, September 16th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Also, a reminder that each broadcast is recorded and is available on NCTC's website to view afterwards. Once again, I want to thank you, Desi, for your presentation and your time with us today, and thank everyone else viewing at home. Thank you for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of your Thursday and a great weekend.
Thank you, everyone.